Both of these chips are extra spicy, but one of them brings a whole lot more flavor to the table. We're going to talk to you about the new Ryzen 9 9900X and 9950X as we try to figure out what makes them tick, right here, right now on Robeytech. The Ryzen 9 9900X and 9950X are here to give us a much more complete picture of the Ryzen 9000 series of desktop CPUs. And boy, do they ever tell us a different story than what we've already seen. But what is clear is that AMD has given us a series of CPUs that not only performs better than their Ryzen 7000 series counterparts, but they're more mindful of both power draw and a touch more considerate with their launch pricing. Now, we've already seen the Ryzen 7 9700X running circles around Intel in gaming performance at less than 88 watts. And on pricing, each CPU in the series launched at a lower price than their 7000 series counterpart. In the case of the Ryzen 9 9900X and the 9950X, we're talking about $50 lower. So that's $499 for the 9900X and $649 for the 9950X. Now, in case you've slept since the last time you looked at CPU prices, here's what the current landscape looks like at the time of making this video. It looks like AMD has priced the 9900X close to the 14700K, while the 9950X is hanging around the 14900KS's backyard, looking for a fight. With pricing in mind, let's get to know more about the Ryzen 9s. To start off, these two CPUs keep the same core count as their predecessors, so 12 cores and 24 threads for the 9900X and 16 cores and 32 threads for the 9950X. What is different here is that the 9900X and 9950X both have a slightly higher L1 cache, but slightly lower base clock than the 7900 and the 7950X. Don't worry, that doesn't mean that they're going to perform worse. AMD is also using TSMC's 4nm process for the Ryzen 9000 CPU cores versus 5nm process on the 7000 series. Essentially, this smaller process allows for a higher transistor density, which can positively affect efficiency. With that in mind, let's jump into the metrics, starting with the power. When we look at the TDP of these chips, and remember, TDP is thermal power design, not max socket power, the 9900X stepped back to 120 watts from the 7900X's 170 watts, while the 9950X stayed at the same 170 watt TDP as its predecessor. If you're looking at this from the perspective of max socket power, or PPT, the 9900X has a PPT of around 162 watts, while the 9950X has a PPT of 230 watts. We'll see these numbers come into play under full CPU load. At idle, the 9900X ran at an average of 28 watts, while the 9950X averaged 29. We saw a similar story when we looked at the 9600X and the 9700X. In other words, the resting power draw is higher than Intel's 14th gen CPUs, but lower than Ryzen 7000 series predecessors. We mentioned this in our other video, which you should absolutely check out right here if you want to know about the 9600X and the 9700X, but it's worth bringing up again. Remember that all the Zen 5 cores in the processor are performance cores. I think we're seeing Intel's E-cores showing off here while our systems are working hard at hardly working. Under full CPU load, we saw the 9900X making use of its full power cap with a CPU watt average of 160 watts, which was about 4 watts lower than the 7900X. Now, the 9950X, however, drew around 195 watts under load, which was 16 watts more than the 7950X. Even so, the 9950X still drew less power than the 14700K's 236 watts and the 14900K's 248 watts. I want you to hold on to this for a moment because the difference in power averages between the 9950X and the 14900K is over 53 watts. Now, moving on to gaming, this delta is much narrower. The 9900X has a CPU watt average of 120 watts, while the 9950 had a higher power draw at 131 watts. These were in line with 7000 series, with the 9000 series Ryzen 9s running an average of 1 to 3 watts lower. They were still lower than the 14700K's 166 watt average and the 14900K's slightly more efficient diet of 152 watts. Translating all of this into thermals, at idle, the 9950X matched the 9700X at 39 degrees Celsius, while the 9900X averaged 47. Comparatively, the 9950X ran 7 degrees cooler than the 7950X, while the 9900X ran 6 degrees hotter than the 7900X. Intel came out at a win at idle, but hey, when you're only drawing 4 to 7 watts versus 22 to 28, there's going to be a difference in heat generated. Now, moving on to CPU load, the 9950X held a remarkably cool average temperature of 78 degrees Celsius under load, which was 17 degrees cooler than the 7950X and 3 degrees cooler from the 14900K. At 87 degrees under load, the 9900X managed to keep itself 8 degrees cooler than its predecessor, but it still ran 4 degrees hotter than the 14700K and 9 degrees hotter than the 9950X. Now, interestingly enough, 87 degrees was the same temperature average we saw when we slapped the Cooler Master MA824 Stealth Air Cooler on the 9950X and ran a CPU load test. Yep, we air-cooled a 9950X for science. And finally, in gaming thermals, the 9950X averaged 64 degrees Celsius, which was 13 degrees lower than the 7950X, but 3 degrees higher than the 14900K. The 9900X, on the other hand, averaged 70 degrees, which was still 1 degree cooler than the 7900X and the 9600X. What can we tell you about gaming? Well, we ran into something weird, and if you watched our video on the 9700X, you may pick up that the performance is not even close. But we do know what's happening, and we're going to share all of that after the numbers. Now we're going to show you some metrics on the screen here, and we're mainly going to focus on the 9950X for this part. In Cyberpunk 2077, we saw an average of 175 frames per second from the 9950X. In Forza Horizon 5, the 9950X averaged just below 317 frames per second. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, 418 frames per second. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 293 frames per second. And finally, in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, 412 frames per second. Now, if you were paying attention to the charts, that's not an amazing showing for the 9950X when we've seen what the 9700X can do, and I know you were seeing that on the screen at the same time. Keep in mind, those are still good frame rates, and it does look like it leads the 14900K in performance per watt, but it's not a runaway success like the 9700X. So, what the heck is happening here? For starters, the 9900X and the 9950X have two core chiplet dies, or CCDs, within their core complex, or CCX structure. Essentially, the 9900X, a 12-core CPU, is made up of two 6-core CCDs, like the one found in the 9600X, while the 9950X, a 16-core CPU, is made up of two 8-core CCDs found in the 9700X. Are you mathing with us so far? You'd think that putting two awesome CPUs together would just mean more awesomeness, right? Well, it's not that simple. See, the multi-chiplet design is great for getting more cores into the CCX, but it creates some latency when processors try to work across CCDs, especially in 1 to 2 cores. So is the latency terrible? No, but it does introduce an extra step of communication between the two CCDs, which explains why we're seeing a hit in gaming performance on Ryzen 9s and not with these single CCD chips. Hey, what's up guys? Robeytech here, and interrupting this review because we learned something from AMD right in the middle of the review after we kind of posted our data. So while we're talking about CPU function here, it's actually important to mention that AMD recommends, which this is new, they actually recommend parking the cores, which I don't know why. This wasn't something we had to do on the 7900X or the 7950X, but in order to get the performance that you are supposed to expect from the 9900 and 9950X, they're recommending making sure you have the right chipsets, making sure that you basically have Game Bar installed, making sure that you also have the Xbox Game app installed so it knows it's an actual app, and then it parks half the cores or the other CCD so you get the uplift in performance. Now, we did actually test this. We did actually run some side-by-side tests, and actually initially we got lower performance, but then we realized we hadn't turned Expo on. So then we found out we got the exact same performance, and we did check and our cores were not parking, which was the original problem we actually had with the X3D versions of these chips, and why we didn't recommend them initially, because there was a lot of work to set these up. The short of it is that AMD is specifically recommending that, unlike normally when you install these things, you can just kind of plug and play and turn them on, that now there's some extra effort if you are going to game on the 9950X and the 9900X in order for these chips to work correctly, is that you also need to make sure the game bar is up to date, etc., and that the cores actually park. This just further kind of pushes our conclusion that these chips are not really made for gaming. If you are wanting to game and do performance, I don't know if this is the right choice for you. That's a call you're going to have to make, because you actually may see degraded performance in terms of gaming versus maybe potentially looking at the 7950X or the 7900X for your options there, or potentially even a 13th or 14th gen Intel chip, given that we have the microcode fixes and stuff like that. Again, don't know why this is happening. I'm not entirely sure I'm on board with this whole thing. I don't think it worked very well in previous generations. I don't expect it to work well on this generation. This is something that they were telling us they were going to fix via a BIOS update, and it's now been a year plus and we still haven't seen that fix. But this is what AMD is recommending. This was surprise news to us. It is actually in their reviewer's guide, and yeah, just something to be aware of if you're going to pick up one of these chips and game on them. Guys, this just isn't really a gaming chip, so something to be aware of. Now, these numbers were collected at 1080p with basically the lowest possible visual settings to drive as many frames as we can into the CPU to get CPU usage. These tests are going to expose pressure points for any CPU. Remember, the higher we go up in resolution, the more your system is leaning on your GPU. That's not to say that your CPU is unimportant, but it's going to matter less and less when you move from 1440p to 4K to 8K and beyond. But this This is only part of the Zen 5 story, and again, we really probably have to think about where these CPUs are targeted, which is more at multi-core and productivity. So in our last video, we were perplexed by what we saw out of the 9700X here. Sure, it had a 4% lead over the 7700X, but its performance seemed to really plateau beyond 2 cores and 4-thread operations. Again, it was running at 88 watts, which is awesome, but it just felt lacking, especially when compared across the aisle. Then the Ryzen 9s kind of walked through the door and said, you know what? We'll take it from here. At least the 9950X did. See, the 9900X did take some swings at the 14700K, with the 14700K having a 3% lead over the 9900X in Cinebench. But it was the 9950X that really delivered the knockout blow. In Cinebench, the 9950X put up a multi-core score of 41,778, which demolishes our 14900K score by 12%. I know some of you guys are yelling, Robey, that's not a fair comparison. The 14900K may have 32 threads as well, but 16 of those are E-cores. And to that I would say you're right to a point, but there's one detail here to remember. The 14900K was pulling an average of 248 watts to get its score, while the 9950X was pulling an average of 195 watts. That's a lot of power on both ends, and these are both powerful CPUs, but I think we have a new champion of multi-core in both performance and efficiency. So with all that in mind, let's talk about the bigger 9900X and 9950X picture as we start to land this plane. Understand, what we're about to share isn't a final review. This is more of a starting line than a finish line. And anybody who says this is the definitive review for a brand new CPU that you've only had for a week is lying. So all the data we collect is from a pre-release BIOS, and like every other CPU before it and likely every CPU after it, these processors will mature over time and we'll have a far clearer picture of how they're going to work as we get more experience using them. What we can say today is this: the 9900X has a bump in performance over the 7900X in multi-core performance and overall efficiency, but gaming performance didn't take as big of a leap as we had hoped to see. There's also consideration that the 9900X is more expensive than the 14700K. While it takes a few nice swings, the 14700K does balance gaming performance and high power compute at a better price than the 9900X. That being said, the 9900X would get you 14700K performance on a platform that will be supported through 2027 and beyond. And if that longevity is appealing to you, then awesome. As for the 9950X, this thing crushes multi-core workloads and high-level CPU-bound tasks. Not only does the 9950X show strong generational improvement, it also leads in efficiency over the 14900K. Now, it's priced more comparatively to the 14900KS, and we don't have the data to show side by side to really tell that story, but with how much power that beast draws and the amount of cooling you need to tame it, it's like best on the planet Hoth. We're going to take a wild guess that it's the same efficiency rules that still apply here. What we also love is that the 9950X can be air-cooled thanks to its lower power draw and thermals. Now, to be fair, you've got to use a chunky air cooler on it, but it definitely opens up build options for a flagship CPU. Now, if you're looking for the ultimate gaming chip, these ones aren't it. The 9700X takes the crown for the 9000 series at a significantly lower power, but the 9700X hasn't taken the 7800X 3D's crown as of yet. And to be clear, guys, you still have 7000 series, and those are still a lot cheaper, so you can make the call on that too. At the end of the day, what the new Ryzen 9 show us is that it's possible to get high-powered CPU performance with a lower power draw. This does come at the expense of gaming performance, which, man, that latency is a killer. But even still, neither one of these are horrible at gaming. They just have some challenges keeping up with their contemporaries in the same family. However, if you're looking to maximize efficiency without sacrificing CPU power, the 9950X really does achieve AMD's goal of power per watt leadership. Now, we do have a more in-depth review that we're going to be releasing very soon that will talk about the whole 9000 series as it stands, and actually, given our time with it, gives more of our thoughts and where these things kind of fit. And if you want to see that and check it out, it'll be available right here. You won't see an image here, but you'll see the link. And there you have it. Those are our initial thoughts on the Ryzen 9 9900X and the 9950X CPUs. Now, if you're interested in building a 9950X rig, we have links down below for a $3,000 Arctic Showcase build that doesn't break the bank but still looks amazing. And then also like just a powerhouse $2,300. It's all about the performance and inking the most out of your bank account. But we want to know what you think. Are you excited to see the massive multi-core performance of the 9950X? And if so, what would you use that kind of power for? Also, if you plan on building one of these Ryzen 9 systems we linked down below, let us know down in the comments below. Better yet, hop on over to Robeytech Discord and post pictures of the new rig. And you know what? While we're at it, and while you're down there, why don't you go ahead and slap that subscribe button, whip that like button, and ring that notification bell so that you get a notification each and every time we post videos like this right here on Robeytech. Also, we'd love to have you follow us on all the socials, all at Robeytech, absolutely everywhere. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.